welcome everybody. I hope that your holidays have gone well so far and healthy. This is our last performance or our last event for the year for Suffrage Forward. And we're in collaboration with the Historical Society of Rockland County. And our program this evening is Inside Out, Women, Fashion, and the Fight to Vote. I'm Paulette Ross. I'm the chair of Suffrage Forward, and we're a component fund under the Rockland Community Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to celebrate events such as the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, as well as bringing awareness to the strength, the power, resiliency, and persistence of women in the past and present. And we also want to inspire people in our quest for equality for all. You can learn more about us if you visit our website, suffrageforward.org, and see what we have done and what we will be doing for 2021. We're also on Facebook and on Instagram. Now, this has been a really strange year for everybody. And I call it the year of the pivot. And we had in-person live events, and due to circumstances, we had to pivot, and now we're in this virtual world. And it's pretty interesting to get involved, and I hope that you will be enjoying this webinar. Now is the time of year where we're welcoming in a new year. And I think in this country, we spend our time looking back at the year that's ending. Well, we decided, why not go back 100+ years and look at the fashion and how the styles, their influence, and how they've evolved, or maybe not. And we're so pleased to be able to collaborate with the Historical Society of Rockland County on this, our last event of 2020. There's a person on your screen that has a BA degree from SUNY Binghamton and a master's in history from Patterson University, specializing in American studies. And Susan Deeks is that person, and she's a native of the Lower Hudson Valley and has been the executive director of the Historical Society of Rockland County since 2013, right? Susan, yeah, okay, good. At least I got that right. And her decades of experience in developing these compelling programs for historical sites include the Hermitage Museum in Bergen County, New Jersey, as well as Ringwood State Park and the Long Pond Ironworks State Park in Passaic County, New Jersey. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Susan to tell you more about the Historical Society of Rockland County and our program this evening. So I hope you enjoy it. And now, Susan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Paulette.
You're welcome.
The Historical Society of Rockland County is a museum and educational organization dedicated to engaging diverse audiences in a dynamic dialogue about the rich historical heritage of Rockland County. That's our mission. We have been at our site at 20 Zucker Road in New City since 1975, when we opened for the bicentennial celebration of American Revolution. And we have done ongoing programming highlighting aspects of Rockland's history using our large collection of artifacts that represent both Rockland and Lower Hudson Valley history. Inside Out is our Suffrage Centennial exhibition. It was co-curated by Jennifer Brooks, who will be presenting tonight, and Christine Kowalski, and draws from some of the hundreds of items of clothing and apparel and accessories that we have in our permanent collection. It highlights the time period of suffrage as women started to fight in the 1870s up through winning the vote in 1918 by using clothing items that Jennifer will show you as we go through the presentation tonight. So without further ado there, I'm going to introduce Jennifer Brooks, Education Coordinator at the Historical Society of Rockland County and tonight's presenter.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so Sue and Paulette said it all. That was a wonderful, wonderful introduction. So yes, I'm the Education Coordinator and co-curator of Inside Out, Women, Fashion, and the Fight for the Vote. So yes, as Sue said, today we're going to be exploring the fashions of the first 3 decades of the 20th century. So the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. And we're going to trace the evolutions of those trends as we saw fashion turn from Victorian to decidedly, you know, flapper, as they say, and how those trends evolved alongside women's political and social standings evolving. We're gonna head right into it. We do ask that if you have any questions, please hold them until the end, or you can type them into the chat function. And then we'll have a Q&A section moderated at the end of the presentation. I'm also going to hop off the camera and I will join you again back at the end. All right, so let's get started. All right, there we go. Let me get this out of the way. Yes, so every morning when we wake up and we get out of bed and we open our closets and we choose what we're going to wear, we are making a political decision. Fashion is our way of communicating how we feel, who we think we are, and most importantly, who we want to be in this world, how we want others to see us. So in a society like ours, that is a political statement. And the suffragists knew this, and we're going to see how they used this to their advantage, as well as other women kind of claiming a new identity for a new era. Fashion can sometimes be brushed off as like a very vain or frivolous or feminine, you know, area lens of study. And it wasn't until recently that fashion history was even accepted as an academic lens with which to study the past. But for a historian like myself, it is one of the most valuable resources we have, because it is that bridge between the internal, everyday, forgotten, individual parts of history and then those momentous events that are written in history books. And that's true when we look at the suffrage movement, especially because women primarily used fashion to express themselves and their power in a world where they were often disenfranchised. So the question is, what happened to fashion when women were finally politically enfranchised? And that is the wonderful transitory era of the first 3 decades of the 20th century that we're going to explore. What does this tell us about the internal lives of the early women who fought for their rights? How did fashion help sway public opinion to make this once radical idea of women's suffrage a reality? So let's jump right into it. The new woman. Irish writer Sarah Grand coins the term new woman in an article published in 1894. Sarah Grand was mainly a novelist whose work focused on the inequities of marriage, how the institution favors a man's prospects and keeps young women oppressed and uneducated. So after the term's initial publication in other British, in other newspapers and subsequent works, other British writers began to take up this idea, and thus a new woman for the turn of a new century was born. So this impacted the suffrage movement in the UK, which predates the heart of the American suffrage movement by a few years, but it eventually did make its way across the pond. The new woman is an enfranchised woman with education, talent, independence, who is not beholden to men in politics or marriage, is what Sarah Grand would answer if you asked her what a new woman was. And this kind of develops as a political idea alongside an aesthetic ideal. So this is the fashions of the era, isn't it? So we're gonna kind of delve into what this new woman looked like at the turn of the century. Designing the new woman. Charles Dana Gibson, that name might be very familiar, the illustrator, began publishing his drawings and illustrations in periodicals like Life magazine and Time magazine, starting in the 1890s and up until about the 1910s. depicting what Sarah Grant herself might call a new woman. Today, we know these illustrations as the famous Gibson girl. That name is usually attached to the hairstyle that these women in these illustrations would have. They would have these, perfectly coiffed hairstyles with waves piled atop their heads. But there's more than just the hair to these illustrations. Gibson was beginning to depict a new interpretation of femininity and womanhood. And this was so important because this was published on a national scale. He kind of depicted these beautiful, tall, goddess-like women who were educated, talented, witty, athletic, academic, in all these different scenarios. And usually the foil being the contrast of his Gibson girl with what was expected of a quote-unquote feminine woman at the time. During these years, we also have famous fashion houses of the 1920s beginning to open their doors, including Paul Poiret, Coco Chanel, Jean Paquin, Madeleine Vionnet. Paul Poiret in particular, who is known as the father of 1920s fashions, opened his doors as early as 1903. And this is when the fashions of the era were still decidedly Victorian, as a la this very elegant woman right here. So this was a slow but steady evolution during these 3 decades. So here we have 2 Gibson illustrations which serve as wonderful examples of what the new woman was beginning to look like and act like. So on the left, we have an image of a woman in a bathing costume on the beach with her hair, of course, swept up in that iconic Gibson girl style. And the caption reads, "Of course there are mermaids." So here it's also very important to note the comparison of the Gibson girl with a mythical creature of a mermaid, because fashion of these decades were heavily inspired by what we call neoclassical designs, which echo ancient Greece and Rome. And the suffrage movement was very particular too about drawing up these ideas, these ancient ideas of these venerated democracies that our country is based on. On the right, we have a woman, again, very, very fashion forward in her Gibson girl updo and her bare shoulders, sitting at the center of 2 very stiff looking young men. And the caption here reads, "A word to the wise, have a book in case you are bored." So let's break this down. We began to see the feminist ideal of political emancipation and education aligning with a popular feminine ideal. So Gibson is kind of turning the male gaze on its head by challenging the idea that the quote unquote perfect or ideal woman isn't political, because in Gibson's world, she is. Even depicted as smoking and drinking and hunting and sport, here are becoming feminine ideals. And he pushes this even further challenging these conventions, because in the world of these illustrations, men fall head over heels for the Gibson girl. And at this time, anti-suffrage propaganda was all over, which would depict suffragists as brutish and unnatural and manly and animalistic. And it's really, really nasty, nasty illustrations. So this is really significant that we see feminists as feminine. Significant in empowering the women who might see these illustrations as they, flip through Time magazine on a Sunday morning, or, for men who are having their preconceived notions of femininity being challenged. And we'll keep exploring, keep this in mind, because we'll keep exploring. We'll just see how integral aligning the feminine ideal with the feminist ideal was for the actual passage of the 19th Amendment. So we're understanding how public opinion began to accept this idea of a new woman and how designers embraced it. But what did these designs look like exactly? What details of the cut and the pattern changed in the decade between Victorian and Edwardian? So in the first decade of the 20th century, women still preferred Victorian fashions of high collars, lots of full bell-shaped, multi-paneled skirts. the oversized pigeon breast blouses, fitted tightly at the waist, were very, very popular. Padding at the hip and at the bust was very popular to get that S-bend silhouette. And at the same time, Paul Poiret was beginning to innovate fashions to more closely align it with what we know as the 1920s trends. We began to see beginnings of the drop waist creeping in here as the waistlines creep back up to empire cut, which is derived from the fashions of the early 19th century. Here we even have this dress, which kind of looks like to be a sheath style, only kind of tapered in here with this tunic. And this is from 1908, I should mention. And it's also important to mention that the empire waist style, which is beginning to come back, was last seen 100 years prior to this, the turn of the 19th century, after the Revolutionary War of Independence, in which American society was beginning to take shape, drawing from ancient Rome, ancient Greece, these ancient democracies. So we kind of see this political influenced fashion coming back again during the suffrage era. So empire waistlines were very, very popular around 1910 to 1913. Waistlines slowly dropped lower and lower until by 1924, the very stylish garments would have no waistlines at all. Skirt shapes also mimicked that turn of the 19th century style, which would be very, fewer panels, straighter, and kind of tighter around the ankles in the ways like we see here, and especially in this garment here. So here, two lovely, lovely garments. One from Boston and one from the Historical Society of Rockland County that we have on display now. So on the left is a Grecian pageant costume from 1900. On the right, walking suit from 1908. So on the left, this is a 20th century interpretation of Grecian attire. So of course it's not in any way, historically accurate to antiquity, but this is the 20th century interpretation of it. We see the most important elements of the garment that stand out: this center box pleat, center front, with these two panels kind of cascading in pleating down the side in like a tunic-like fashion. And there's a beautiful trim that, if you zoom closely, these are leaves. And then we also have this more of a geometrical trim on the base of the underskirt here, which of course that geometric trim is very popular in neoclassical architecture as well. And this garment is made of a wool broadcloth. Now looking on the right to kind of compare these two. Again, we see a box pleat center front. These two panels kind of hanging down. This is of course a jacket. This is rather just a little bit of draping here. But then we also see this mimicked in the overskirt here. And again, a very interesting trim which evokes both floral and geometric designs. And this is also made in a tan wool broadcloth. So there's no way to know if this Rockland designer was influenced by this garment in particular, but their similarities, regardless, show how neoclassical trends manifested themselves in the 20th century. So some other fun little elements of style from the 1910s. We have, in 1914, this very strange hobble skirt made an appearance. The style is named after the very awkward hobble women had to perform to walk in it. So it was a straight paneled skirt which tapered at the ankles, very similar to mermaid cut gowns that some women wear today. But for everyday wear, this is, as you can imagine, highly impractical. You'll even see some little like blurbs in newspapers here and there that instances of women falling and injuring themselves and twisting their ankle because they were wearing a hobble skirt. And by 1915, this trend disappeared almost completely. And then by 1916, swing 180 in the other direction, and circle skirts came into fashion. This trend dissipated very quickly too, despite foreshadowing another revolutionary design, which would be Christian Dior's New Look in 1947. You can see very, very similar here with the kind of circle skirt with the crinoline and the kitten heels. But of course, 1916 is World War I era, and it's very impractical to use so much yardage when you have other, pressing wartime concerns. So that's can account for why this trend never really took off. Necklines evolved too, very slowly, but showing more skin during the day, which was once only appropriate during very formal evening events. This is a fantastic example of the hobble skirt and the intersection of fashion and politics. So if we have a very high fashion woman here in the style of the Gibson girl, standing next to, kind of towering over this man next to her. And the caption reads, "Yet they say women are making great strides." All right, so foundation garments. Corsets did not disappear in the 1920s, but women did gain freedom of choice when it came to their underwear. And just to, quickly debunk some fashion history myths I will hear from time to time. It's important to remember that while these quote unquote Victorian fashions, I say quote unquote Victorian because we're also kind of going before and after the Victorian era, but they represented a time for women in which they were disenfranchised and oppressed, and the garments and the clothes also symbolized that disenfranchisement. The garments themselves weren't any more physically oppressive than the clothes that we wear today. Was the extra yardage inconvenient? Yes, certainly. And were some of these clothes probably physically restrictive? Certainly. But it wasn't any more than what we might wear today, like jeans, for example. Jeans are one of the most restrictive garments that you could ever wear. And we wear them every day. And we also want to remember that trendy clothes are always uncomfortable. And women had the option to dress comfortably if they wanted to, just like women today have the option to dress uncomfortably if they want to. And each era requires a certain silhouette, which is achieved with shapewear. So of course you would have the corset. A well-fitted corset would not be any more uncomfortable than an underwire bra or Spanx. And of course, like I mentioned, if you wanted to dress comfortably, you could easily do so. You didn't have to wear a constrictive corset. But achieving that fashionable silhouette was prioritized. It was very important for whatever reason. But it was still something that women opted to do. And we, just to kind of delve into the actual silhouettes and how they changed, but, just were still as oppressive to the body, if you will. We have this manipulation of the silhouette here. So we have this woman certainly is wearing padding in her bust and at her hip to kind of create the illusion of a very small waist. And this is the S-bend style. And here, this is later on a fashion, probably from around 1912, 1913, 1914. She would be wearing a long line corset. So again, the silhouette is different. However, to create this boyish style that was beginning to kind of come into the forefront of fashion, you would still need shapewear. It would just be a different kind of manipulation of the silhouette. It was a compression of the curves of the Edwardian era to the straight lines of the 1920s. So yeah, kind of this whole debunking is, the moral of the story is to take everything with a grain of salt, right? And we also have two examples of some early shapewear. So here we have a 1929 corset. So again, it's this long line corset that stretches almost all the way down to the thighs. And here we have the very first pattern patent of the brassiere, which was November 3rd, 1914, it reads up here. So this is the very first design of a garment that we still wear today. It's very, very popular then, and it's popular now. All right, so the rise of the shirtwaist. So one of the, arguably the most important garments of this era was the shirtwaist. So a shirtwaist is a very kind of basic foundation garment, usually made in a white cotton or linen that tied or buttoned around the waist. And it was meant for mixing and matching with different skirts, different jackets. And it was a menswear piece. So it was very easy to you know, where it was appropriate for day-to-day errands, but then it was also able to transition into professional wear that while remaining comfortable. This was especially important when women flooded the workforce during the American introduction to World War II in 1917. So yes, a very, very important garment. And shirtwaists carry a lot of political connotations. Notably in 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory caught fire in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, right off of Washington Square Park, the 9th floor of the building in particular, where young immigrant girls were packed in, making these garments. The doors were locked for whatever reason, maybe to stop the girls from taking breaks or stealing material. But regardless, when the fire broke out, they were trapped. The flames were fueled by cotton in the workroom, and many girls suffocated, burned, or jumped to their deaths. 146 workers in total perished. 123 of them were young girls and women, girls as young as 14 years old. And this was Manhattan's worst workplace disaster until September 11th, 2001. And this was a notable event for the suffrage movement and for labor rights legislation and fire safety in Manhattan. So again, another intersection of a tragic intersection of politics and fashion. And we also, you know, kind of a little tag on something that we can connect our experience with. The pandemic, the influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, this could be another possible factor in the growing preference for casual, easier to wear fashions, because as we know from experience, that's something that we're all leaning towards. I've heard it on NPR, different stories about how women are ditching high heels, women are buying house coats again. So it's very, very interesting, kind of this evolution of fashion. And this might, in reference to the pandemic, this might not have necessarily been recorded as something important in the evolution of fashion, but very well might have influenced it. All right, so this is where it all kind of culminates. March 3rd, 1913, the Women's Suffrage Parade marches down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., in an effort to bring wider awareness and acceptance of the suffragists' push for national women's suffrage. This was organized by Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this was staged mostly as a rebuke to that nasty anti-suffrage propaganda that was hampering the movement. And it was also, public opinion was not necessarily in favor of the amendment. And public opinion is one of the most important aspects of any piece of legislation passing. So this was certainly staged very particularly as like good press for the suffrage movement. This was a carefully choreographed and carefully costumed event, because suffragists knew that this was their chance and they could use fashion to their advantage. So they wore white, the famous color of suffrage, to evoke that kind of purity and godliness and, of the movement. And And there were even costumes which would depict suffragists as these ancient goddesses, or these civic virtues of justice, of peace and liberty, which our country was built upon. So they were essentially doing the same work of Gibson's cartoons in the early 1900s, making these feminist ideals feminine, and in evoking those classical virtues. What better argument for the suffrage movement? These are the virtues which our country was built upon, and these are the virtues in which we embody. So again, what more natural path for our country than to grant full suffrage? So we have this very powerful image of the activist Inez Milholland, who led the parade, riding astride a white horse, wearing her full kind of neoclassical costume. And she was, in that moment, a living symbol of the new woman. So here are two images from this event. Here we have an image of what was called the pageant, and to open the parade, and it was exactly that, presenting the suffrage movement as, direct descendant of these classical ideals, costuming these young girls and women as classical virtues, as a brilliant theatrical argument for suffrage. And here's just a lovely photo of this woman, again, kind of evoking these ancient virtues and holding her American flag. And we can see all of the women dressed in white in the back. All right, so without further ado, we're going to jump into the gallery walk section of our presentation. We've prepared a video taking you through the garments that we have on display, and kind of delving more into the trends and the construction of the garments, and putting it into perspective of Rockland County as well. Garment, more than likely because they were accessories, other
Hi, my name is Jennifer Brooks. I'm the education coordinator here at the Historical Society of Rockland County, and today I'm going to be taking you through a portion of our brand new exhibit, Inside Out: Women, Fashion, and the Fight for the Vote. So our exhibit here focuses on this idea of the new woman at the dawn of the 20th century, which represented the enfranchisement women were hoping to seek through the passage of the 19th Amendment, but which also impacted developing fashion trends at the time. So what we're going to be focusing on today is less about the politics and more about the clothes. So we're going to be looking at our 8 mannequins that we have on display, which take us through the first 3 decades of the 20th century, so from the year 1900 to the year 1928. And we're going to examine how these trends changed and morphed throughout the years and see what that meant for women's lives. So let's get started on our first garment. So this is a beautiful 2-piece bodice and skirt set from around the year 1900. So we'll take a look at the construction of this garment. So we have 2 pieces, I mentioned, a boned bodice and skirt with a little bit of a train. There is a lavender, very light cotton lining, black cotton netting with some silk trim at the wrists and at the hem, and a beautiful cotton netting insert with a silk lining. So looking at this dress, the coloring and the texture tells me that this was probably worn as a half mourning dress. So around this time it was customary that women could choose to go into public mourning, which would be signified with the way that they dressed. So if they went into full mourning for the first year, they would wear all black and very matte fabrics, not too much decor, not too many shiny, expensive fabrics, to signify the death of a spouse or another close family member. After that year had passed, they could go into half mourning, in which they could begin to incorporate some colors and some more textures, which is exactly what we see in this dress right here. So if we also look at the silhouette of the dress, it is exactly in the S-bend style of the early 19th century, which mostly that silhouette was centered around the S-bend corset. So very popular to have the large pigeon breast and padded hips on the skirts. So this is exactly what we see here. So a beautiful example of the formality that women still had in the day-to-day wear of the early Edwardian period. So let's move on to our next gown, skipping ahead a few years to 1906, 1908. This is a beautiful walking suit in a tan wool broadcloth with some red applique trim and an oriental style design. So this is a very well-tailored garment, which would have been done by a local dressmaker here in Rockland County. So this is a walking suit, and a walking suit is based off of the three-piece suit that became very popular for men in the 19th century. This is the women's answer to that. So it is three pieces. We have a very nice skirt, a jacket, and it would have been worn with a shirt waist, which is a woman's garment that looked like a man's dress shirt, essentially. So if we just take a quick look at the construction again, we have very beautiful box pleats on the jacket and on the skirt. And this is a walking suit was a very popular choice because it was great for going about your day-to-day errands while still maintaining a look of professionalism. And the walking suit implies a certain level of masculinity in your garment, which was very useful to the suffragists. If you see any photos of suffragists, most of them are going to be wearing walking suits because of the practicality and power of the garment. So a beautiful example from right here in Rockland County. Let's head to our next garment. We have a beautiful gray silk evening gown. So this is a lovely garment because it really begins to show how styles transitioned from one era to the next and how we can pinpoint those in very particular garments. So looking at the construction, at the waistline, there is not a waistline per se, but rather the fabric is cut on the bias. So it's cut a little bit against the grain, so when it's stitched together, it has a cinching effect. So this is very suggestive of the straight sheath styles of the 1920s. It's in a very 1910s Edwardian style still, because we have the longer tiered skirts and we have the sleeves and still a little bit of pigeon breast shape going on. But again, a lovely, very simple and sleek transitional garment, which really begins to incorporate both elements of both eras. So let's move on now to our, this is 1910, so we're now moving on to our next decade. So before we get into some of these newer fashions, I want to touch quickly on some corset myths, because silhouette is very, very important to fashion history. So when looking at these extant garments, sometimes I hear the misconception that women must have been so small back then, or they must have been tight lacing their corsets and they're cinching their waists so small that they were breaking ribs. That's unfortunately not true, even though it's very entertaining. It's a myth because if we're looking at these garments that are in such good condition, having lasted for so long, and the waists are so small, it's more than likely because no other women in the family could wear them due to their very small size, so that's why they remain in such good condition. Dresses would be altered and changed for changing fashion trends, and if a dress is too small, it's hard to alter and hard to do anything with, so they sit in a closet, they end up in a museum. So that's what we're looking at here. Another myth is the myth of corsets were so uncomfortable, medieval torture devices. Corsets were a great asset to women, especially when having to wear these layered garments. They kept your posture nice and straight. They supported the weight of the petticoats and the skirts, which could really hurt your back and sag after a while. Corsets were usually, if they were fitted properly to your measurements, they were very, very comfortable. Some corsets of the 19th century were made with whalebone, baleen. So whalebone is absorbs your body heat, kind of molds to the curves of your body. So very comfortable, easy to wear. You can play sports and do lots of work in corsets. So it's important to remember that aspect of women's lives, that corsets weren't horrible, oppressive garments. They actually dictated a lot of the style and silhouette that we see. It was more aesthetic than anything else, just as much as it was practical. So now we come to our beautiful suffragist. This is a garment from around 1910 to 1914, which we can date it because of mainly the shape of the skirt and the length of the skirt. We're already seeing that much less fabric is incorporated in these types of cuts and styles. One, because this is a very casual, easy to wear day-to-day dress, and it's in a very simple cotton linen with a very simple design of blue pinstripes. But this is a great example of, like I said, day-to-day wear that is, indicative of what a suffragist might have worn. She's not looking for anything fancy, she's looking for something practical to get the job done. And we still have a little bit of a masculine shape in the shoulder. So this is kind of a shirtwaist situation we have going on. So it's very practical and alludes a little bit to menswear. So another beautiful transitional and practical garment. So let's move on to our next gown, our beautiful brown silk taffeta evening gown from around 1918. So World War I, this is World War I era fashion. And this is really, really indicative of the 1920s. We were really beginning to see a turn towards the straighter styles of the 1920s. The waistline is beginning to sit very low, and it cinches what is an otherwise pretty loose-fitting garment. It's in the pinafore style, so that means it's there's no blouse underneath. We've added this purple camisole, but otherwise you can mix and match with other blouses, so it's a very versatile garment. If we look here, what's very interesting about this, if we look here at the stitching on this peplum, we notice that the yardage is pieced together on the selvage ends, and it's made to give the illusion of one straight piece of fabric. So this is an example of how women would stretch their fabric as far as they could go. There's a very interesting, and which was of concern during wartime, there was a very interesting trend in 1916 of these huge full skirts, which required lots of yardage. They kind of looked like the full skirts of the 1950s. But due to it being wartime, that trend went out of style as fast as it came because it just wasn't practical to be using that much fabric when conservation was the main priority. So went right back to the straight sheath styles, which dictated the 1920s. So keeping in mind kind of this perfect transitional garment, we're going to head into the 1920s. So this is a dress dated to circa 1923, and this is really when we begin to see kind of the famous drop waist flapper style of the 1920s. So we have a waistline. It's not really doing much. It's kind of decorative more than anything else because it's very straight sheath cut style. We still have this neckline, which is beautiful beading on the front, but still a little indicative of late teens styles and trends. It's we have some beautiful, very fine pleating on the sleeve, which I love. But this is 1923, 1924 is really when the famous drop waist styles of the 1920s came into play. In the first few years of the 1920s, clothes still looked a lot like those clothes of the 1910s. So we're really beginning to see an evolution into much, much easier to wear garments that required less complicated structural garments. So we want to remember that women didn't just throw away their corsets at the turn of the decade of New Year's Eve 1919. Rather, corsets kind of morphed into something else. Women could wear corselets, which did more to compress rather than to shape, like the corsets of the early 1900s. But to achieve this boyish silhouette, some structural undergarments were still needed. So you want to remember that fashion is a slow evolution, and that applies to corsets as well. So moving on from 1923, we're going to head well into the 1920s now with this circa 1928 day dress. It's in a beautiful floral printed chiffon, some detailing at the wrists, and an asymmetrical hem and some pleating at the hem. But other than that, it is a simple straight cut garment, great for daytime, for warm weather in the spring and summer. There's a stark contrast in how much fabric is needed for this. Very sheer. This would have been worn with a slip and possibly a corselet or a girdle underneath, but didn't necessarily need it. So a really great example of how style now began to transition more towards the mid-20th century. We have this very interesting closure here, which kind of hugs at the hip, which is a trend during the 1930s to have that very straight kind of hip hugging style. But we're really now beginning to see a stark transition from just 10, 15 years earlier. So let's now move on to our final gown. So this is a beautiful, absolutely beautiful flapper dress. This was worn by Marion Jewett of Upper Nyack, so a great piece of Rockland history. And this is, in particular, an evening gown, but also a dance dress, because we can see how beautiful this checkerboard fringe moves. But it's made of a deep black silk velvet with a silk gold lame slip, an asymmetrical waistline, if you will, even though it falls all the way at the hip, and this really lovely oversized black velvet bow. So if there was any doubt that the new woman has arrived post the passage of the 19th Amendment, this is all the confirmation that you need. So even women who wouldn't have particularly considered themselves political still took part in this enfranchisement of women through what they wore in their day-to-day. So I hope this was very informative, and I hope you learned something. If you would like to come and pay us a visit, we have an exhibit that encompasses so much more than just these gowns. You can see different extant artifacts and accessories and learn a little bit more about how suffragists in particular used fashion. But I'll see you in a few for any questions. Thanks for watching.
All right, so thank you everyone so much for your attention. Now we'll kind of go into our Q&A section, or we will go into our Q&A section. Let me hop back on video here. All right. All right, so I'm just going to check through the chat for any questions or comments. Oh, I see Anita mentioned the Gibson girls also promoted the ideal curvy feminine figure with an impossibly small waist. Yes, that's that classic S-bend shape. And that impossibly small waist was always, it was literally impossibly small because it was always achieved with padding. And we actually have, you didn't see it in the video, but we have some examples of like a hip pad and a bum pad in our, in the exhibit currently. So that's something else you can come and see. All right, I also see this Q&A notification, but I don't know how to open it. All right, so does anyone else have any, any other comments, questions, even if you wanted to turn your screen on and talk to us?
The question in the Q&A is, what changes do you see? This is from Laura. She asks, what changes do you see in women's shoes and heels?
Ooh, we have lots of shoes too on display. We have usually it kind of turned into this more pointy, very kitten heel, slender. Victorian shoes were all about the boots. And boots lived on until the 1910s. And then in the 1920s, we see more of those like kitten-heeled, pointy heels. The T-strap shape shoes were very popular. So I think that's the main change, is that boots were not as frequently worn. Oh, Denise, thank you for sharing these artifacts. It is our pleasure. We're happy to share them with you.
Okay, Anita was asking, what are the hours for the exhibit?
Oh, that is, we are open Wednesday, Thursdays, and Fridays, 1 to 4 p.m. It's best if you make a reservation in advance, just so we, can avoid any groups colliding, because we're very careful about COVID precautions. But we have walk-ins. Sue, is that correct?
Yes, we're taking reservations through our website at rocklandhistory.org. I'll take you to an Eventbrite link to pre-purchase tickets, or you can call us at 845-634-9629. Our number's also at the Rockland History website, and just call and make an appointment. Just to limit the group size, we like people to feel safe in the gallery. We're limiting it to 6 people per day. And the exhibit will be open Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays through October, except this week, of course, we're closed Thursday and Friday, but we are open tomorrow.
Oh, Laura asks, do you have anything else on video or virtual? I'm in Pennsylvania. We do offer our virtual programs here and there from now. This is the only virtual offering on this exhibit in particular. And Sue, I believe we also have other kind of virtual tours on the website. Is that true?
We have some video tours linked on our website. Under the research tab, you can go to our video index. And we're also going to be working on more Zoom programs into the coming year on various topics of Rockland history.
Oh, Carol asks, did you find any surprises when you were researching this exhibit? One thing, Christine and I had a lot of time, because we were closed, we had a lot of time to dig through the collections. And we found an 1870s wedding cake that was perfectly preserved in the collections, which we have a large wedding kind of attire collection, and that was with one of the gowns. It was donated, but an 1870s wedding cake in its original tin, which is crazy. It's so cool that we have that.
There's a question from Lisa. She asks, when did women begin to wear pants as much as today?
I think it was around the 1930s. It was it was more widely accepted, but in the 1850s, there's also this very, very interesting, which again coincided with the mid-19th century suffrage movement, the kind of Seneca Falls era, bloomers. There was this very interesting push for these strange, in the 1850s, these bloomer type pants, which never caught on, but that was kind of another interesting intersection of fashion and suffrage earlier in the 19th century. And then I think it wasn't until the 1930s that they kind of were popular.
I have a question for you, Jennifer. Okay. How do you see the way clothing was designed and used for promotion of their political agenda? How do you see that equating then and now?
That's a good question. I think we definitely see it in, I think it was in Congress, there was this push for the Congresswomen to wear their white pantsuits, which was so wonderful to see, which directly evokes the suffrage movement of this era. But it's very, fashion is very tricky, because you don't, as you're living through it, it's hard to see things evolving. You can only have that hindsight once you're 10 years into the future. So I'm sure, and ask me that question again in 2030, and I'll have a better answer for you.
And Laura's question also was, when did we stop wearing hats?
Oh, I wish I never stopped wearing hats. I love hats. Probably, I think until the 90s, really. The 1990s, I feel like, is when hats were kind of dropped altogether, because I know, like, my grandmother, she has like hats from the 80s that she, they wore, and, I wasn't there. I don't know if anyone else can comment on that. But
Well, there's also a racial component, because Black women often still, when they dress, wear hats, where white women don't at this point, especially in a church setting. We have our very own Frances Pratt in her hats.
That's right. In her many hats,
Her many hats.
which are all fabulous. I think as we get more confident in who we are as women, we start, number one, designing for our needs and wearing what we feel comfortable in. I mean, as a person who owned a boutique and designed shoes and bags, you can look pretty and sexy if you want to, but you don't have to wear 7-inch heels and cut off your toes in order to fit into a pointy shoe. So we start dictating, I think, more of what we need to make the statement and to gain the recognition and the power, but also be comfortable.
yeah, that's a great point too, because the Victorian fashions were, the high fashions were really almost being solely designed by House of Worth, Charles Worth's designs. And then in the 1920s, we see designers like Coco Chanel and Madeleine Vianney designing really intuitive, natural, like wonderful, easy to wear clothes. And that's a really, really great point, that also women kind of taking control of the ship and designing for women is wonderful.
Claire, are you seeing any other questions there?
I just see a comment from Carol Levin. She says in 1874, there was an anti-fashion convention in Vineland, New Jersey, featuring the, quote, American costume, unquote, which was also known as bloomers. That's an interesting tidbit from Carol.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that.
Carol.
And we have another question from Laura asking, I'd be interested to see how handbags or purses changed as well. It seems size and use has really changed.
Yeah. I'd be interested to look into that more too. We have a few bags on display, but nothing, really kind of, nothing showing the progression the way that we showed the progression with the garments.
I think some of it, when you didn't have any responsibility and you were just the arm candy and you had to be there as the possession of the man, you didn't need anything big except maybe a handkerchief or your little snuff box, or that kind of, or your little spectacles. But as we have evolved and gotten more into business and having more power and more responsibilities, you need to carry more things, because having pockets, oh my goodness, that might change your shape. So we don't want bulging pockets, so hence the pocketbook. And now you see, again, with my designing, it's not the big bags anymore. Now we want the smaller bags. We don't want to carry all of this stuff. We don't want the kitchen sink in our hands. And history keeps repeating itself in one way or another. Just
a question from Susan, who asks a question about corsets. What is the basic history on the need or statements? Didn't women break ribs to fit into one?
I hear this a lot. No, women never, ever took out organs or broke any ribs to fit into corsets. I'm not sure where that came from, but that's not the case. Corsets were, I think it was around the 16th century, women would wear stays. And they were they weren't shapely the way that corsets are today. They were flatter across the front, mainly used for just silhouette and also support. corsets and stays would do the work of supporting the skirts and the yardage, which would drag down if you didn't have anything to support it. And a well-fitted corset or a stay would also support your posture and your back while doing work. By the 1840s, corsets are finally called corsets, and they take on that more definitive curvy Victorian shape. And in the mid-19th century, women did tight lace if they wanted to. Very fashionable women. Tight lacing became kind of a trend. So that's sometimes why you see those very, very impossibly tight worn corsets, but that wouldn't be for everyday wear. Women would also Photoshop their photos with ink or markers to make their waists look smaller. So that's, that also is possibly where the myth of like, they must have broken ribs to fit into them because their waists are so small, when actually they kind of just drew over them.
But corsets also were physically deforming. And you have to remember that girls were being put into corsets and body shaping by the age of 8 or 9 years old. So their bodies were actually developing within the confines of corsetry during some of these eras. And there were physical problems. It did restrict your lung capacity. Women did not have, often if high fashion women, upper class women didn't have the lung capacity. Sometimes organs were dislodged or moved around inside the body. So there were some health effects that came with the constriction of being in a corset over a long period of time, mainly among upper class women.
Exactly. That's kind of the distinction between like the high class, the very, very trendy things, which women for trends, some of them they certainly subjected themselves to horrible things, but that wasn't everyone. But right. That's a really good point that Sue makes, that it's the high class women.
They also had servants to take care of a lot of the manual work.
Exactly.
So they didn't have to have the physical strength and stamina.
Exactly.
So we have a question from Jennifer who asks, did the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire lead women to stop wearing the shirtwaist as a movement of solidarity with those women who died, or to protest the poor, unsafe factory working conditions?
Oh my, I haven't actually, I haven't heard of that particular protest that happened, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was like kind of a boycott that happened afterwards. I would have to research that. That's interesting. I mean, shirtwaists still they were worn into the 1920s. So it would have been more of like a symbolic movement at that point, but I would have to look into that.
Claire, do you see any other questions that have come in that we haven't answered yet? Let's see.
And I see Carol has shared lots of different links to things, and I would love to kind of compile those. Actually,
Laura says, Lucy Lockett lost her pocket. I've worn 1770s stays, and they actually work like a brace for lifting. Very helpful.
Yeah, see, that's also well tailored and well fitted garments are much more comfortable than garments that aren't well tailored.
Yes.
Well fitted. So that would make a difference too. So well fitted stays and corsets would have lots of benefits just as much as they might have been, had a few, cons to them.
We have time for one more question if someone has a question or a comment. Okay, Susan, why don't you give contact of where people can get in touch with the Historical Society, and when you're opened, and how long this exhibit will be up and available to see in person.
Sure, we'll do that again. Inside Out is our main gallery exhibit. It's our Suffrage Centennial exhibit. It is open tomorrow, and then after this week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, between 1 and 4 p.m. by appointment. We do ask that everyone wear masks and maintain social distance in the galleries. But if you're looking for something fun to do, we are open, and the exhibit will be on view until the end of October. And while you're visiting us, we have a second woman-centered exhibit, mini exhibit in our Rockland Voices permanent exhibition. It's Being of Light, the statue by Mariel Farlow, and that was curated by Claire Sheridan, and it's a fascinating look at Mariel's statue on the courthouse front lawn that has been controversial and inspiring for 40 years now, or more than 40 years. The Historical Society, we're located at 20 Zucker Road in New City, New York. We can be reached online through our website at rocklandhistory.org, where our other contact information is listed. And we would love to see all of you. If you're not already members also, we are a private nonprofit organization. We are not a county agency. We derive the bulk of our funding from donations and membership dues and program fees. So if you'd like to become a member, it's one of the best bargains in Rockland. It starts at $25 for seniors and goes up from there. And it is our most reliable source of support, and it keeps us operating so that we can preserve Rockland's history for future generations.
That's great. Well, I hope that you, audience, have enjoyed yourselves tonight. You know, it was really very, very interesting of how fashion has evolved and has stayed the same, but with a little twist. And I'd like to thank you, Susan, and you, Jennifer, from the Historical Society of Rockland County. This was just a great, insightful program. And I encourage you all to make your reservation and go and see it in person. And I want to thank Claire Sheridan, who is that little symbol over there that you see on your screen. There she is. There's Claire, our Suffrage Forward Claire, who is responsible for that little loop collage that was at the beginning of this program and hosting this webinar for us. And a big thank you to Rockland County Tourism for their support, Rockland Community Foundation, and of course to all of you who have joined us this evening for your support. And again, you can visit Suffrage Forward's website, suffrageforward.org, to see everything that we have done, what we're all about, what we're going to be doing. We're on Facebook and Instagram. And I just wish you all the happiest, healthiest holiday, and we'll see you next year.